Some moments don't just embarrass you, they brand you. They replay in your head at 2 a.m., in the shower, on the bus, in every quiet place where your mind wanders back to the one scene you wish you could delete from your life. For Aaron Cole, that moment happened under studio lights, with cameras rolling and millions watching. He wasn't just fired from his dream job, he was mocked, laughed at, and turned into a meme shared by strangers who never learned his name, only his humiliation. Most people assumed his story ended there, but what they didn't know was that humiliation can do one of two things: break you forever or become the fuel that builds someone unrecognizable. 10 years after the night that destroyed him, the same network that threw him out invited him back, not as a desperate ex-employee begging for relevance, but as the man who now held the deed to their entire empire. Before this story begins, tap like, subscribe, and tell in the comments if you've ever been written off too soon, because this is for anyone who was ever laughed at before they were finished. The night everything collapsed looked perfect from the outside. The city skyline glowed against a velvet dark sky, neon reflections dancing across glass towers as black cars pulled up to the marble steps of Meridian Broadcasting Studios. Inside, the lobby buzzed with excitement. Producers rushed with clipboards, interns darted between sets, and a live audience lined up, eager to be part of the weekly primetime talk show that promised unfiltered truth. Tonight's episode, according to the promos, was about dead weight in modern workplaces. None of the viewers knew that the dead weight was already standing backstage, clutching a crumpled script with shaking hands. Aaron Cole was 24, a junior segment producer who had clawed his way into the country's biggest media network with nothing but a portfolio, sleepless nights, and a belief that hard work still mattered. He wasn't glamorous. He wasn't connected. He came from a small town, a mechanic father, a cashier mother, and a childhood of second-hand clothes and first-hand responsibility. He lived in a tiny apartment with noisy pipes and cheap coffee, waking up at 4 a.m. to rewrite monologues nobody would ever know he drafted. Yet tonight he had been promised something bigger, a chance to pitch his own segment on air. It was supposed to be his breakthrough. Instead, it became his execution. 5 minutes before the show rolled live, the host, Damian Cross, swaggered over with that crooked smirk the internet adored. Beside him stood Claire, the executive producer, tablet in hand, eyes cold with the kind of power that calculates everything in ratings. They spoke to Aaron in the casual, cruel way people talk to those they've already decided are disposable. They told him to stand by. They told him to be a good sport. They told him nothing about what was about to happen. When the countdown reached 1, the theme music roared, the audience cheered, and Aaron stepped into a spotlight that wasn't made for him. It was made to burn him. The segment began innocently. At least that's how the viewers saw it. Damien sat in his leather chair, laughing with the crowd about lazy employees and office freeloaders. A montage played on the giant screen behind him. Grainy clips of anonymous workers dozing at their desks, dropping files, spilling coffee. The last clip, though, wasn't anonymous. It was Aaron. A shaky phone recording, secretly filmed by a coworker, showed him stumbling sleep-deprived in the editing bay, dropping an entire hard drive and watching footage scatter like his future. The studio exploded with laughter. Aaron's stomach turned to ice. He had never seen that video before. He felt the blood drain from his face as the camera cut to him in real time, standing awkwardly on stage, framed by the very humiliation he had tried so hard to outrun. Damien leaned forward, voice dripping with manufactured empathy. "This," he announced, pointing straight at Aaron, "is what we're talking about. Young people who can't handle pressure, who crumble when given responsibility, and we wonder why the industry is collapsing." The crowd chuckled, then roared. Laughter is contagious when you don't see the human being, only the punchline. Aaron's mic picked up his ragged breathing. He tried to speak, to explain the triple shift he had worked before that mistake, the malfunctioning equipment, the fact that he had fixed the problem alone afterward, but every time he opened his mouth, Damien cut him off. "Excuses, excuses," the host sneered. "This network can't afford dead weight." The words were scripted. The moment was planned. Claire's voice echoed through Aaron's earpiece, cold and final. "Effective immediately, your contract is terminated. Security will escort you out after the show." Silence fell for half a second. Then Damien grinned at the camera, turned Aaron's firing into a teachable moment, and the audience applauded a man being stripped of his dignity on live TV. They didn't see the way his hands trembled, or how his eyes glazed with the realization that his entire future had just been turned into entertainment. Humiliation doesn't end when the cameras stop. It echoes. By midnight, Aaron's segment had been clipped, captioned, and uploaded across every platform. Strangers debated him in comment sections, calling him lazy, fragile, the poster boy for why meritocracy is dead. Some made jokes about his expression when the news hit. Some turned his last name into a trending insult. People he hadn't spoken to since high school sent him links with half-hearted "you okay" messages that felt more like curiosity than concern. Within 24 hours, recruiters stopped responding to his emails. Within 48, his landlord reminded him that rent was due in 2 weeks. For 3 days, Aaron barely left his apartment. The city hummed outside, same as always, horns, sirens, footsteps. But inside, time moved differently. Shame distorted every second. He replayed the moment in his mind, dissecting every word he didn't say, every comeback he wished he had delivered. Rage flickered, then collapsed into exhaustion. One night, staring at the cracked ceiling, he realized something sharp and painful. The people who had ruined him weren't thinking about him at all. For them, he was a segment. For him, it was his entire life. On the 4th day, his father arrived unannounced after a 6-hour bus ride, grease still under his fingernails from the garage. He said little. He just sat on the edge of Aaron's bed, handed him a thermos of coffee, and looked him in the eyes. "They don't get to decide who you become," his father said quietly. "They got the cameras, but you still got your hands, your mind, your time. Use it." It wasn't an inspirational speech. It was a challenge. In that moment, something inside Aaron shifted. He realized he couldn't erase what happened, but he could decide what came after, and nobody would see it coming. Aaron disappeared. At least, that's what the internet thought. The memes died down, replaced by the next scandal, the next outrage. But while the world moved on, he moved inward. He took a job no one would brag about, a low-level data entry position at a tiny regional streaming startup run from a converted warehouse above a bakery. The pay was bad. The office chairs squeaked. The coffee came from a battered machine older than him. But they gave him 2 things Meridian never had: access and indifference. No one there knew or cared about his viral humiliation. To them, he was just another overqualified guy who typed fast and worked late. With no cameras, no spotlights, Aaron began to study. He stayed after hours, not to impress anyone, but to understand everything. How ads were sold, how viewership was tracked, how recommendation algorithms worked. While others clocked out, he traced lines of code, watched dashboards, mapped patterns no one had time to notice. He realized something terrifying and thrilling. The networks that mocked him were bleeding relevance. Their audience was aging out. Their formats were stale. Their arrogance had blinded them to a new kind of attention, fragmented, mobile, hungry for authenticity and choice. He saved every extra cent, skipping meals, walking instead of taking cabs, selling his old camera and laptop to buy a refurbished server.
At night, his cramped room transformed into a command center. A second-hand monitor, a notebook thick with scribbles, sticky notes lining the wall like battle plans. He wasn't dreaming about fame anymore. He was studying power, real power. Not the kind that performs for applause, but the kind that owns the platform applause happens on. And as he learned, one sentence began to lodge itself in his mind. They thought I needed their network to matter. What if I build one they can't ignore?
The turning point came at 2:43 a.m. on a Tuesday, the kind of hour when most people are asleep or scrolling without thinking. Aaron watched a live stream from a small-town musician whose raw, unedited performance was accidentally recommended to thousands. For 10 minutes, the number spiked, then collapsed when the algorithm shifted focus to bigger channels owned by major networks. It was like watching a seedling crushed under a falling tree. In that moment, the idea crystallized. A platform built not to feed the biggest, but to surface the overlooked, to catch the moments the algorithms missed and give them a fighting chance. He called it Emberline. A streaming platform, yes, but more importantly, a discovery engine. Instead of chasing celebrities, it chased patterns of authenticity, long watch times on unknown creators, sudden bursts of engagement on raw, unpolished content, small communities clinging to voices no network cared about. He pitched the concept to investors and was rejected dozens of times. Some laughed at him. Some remembered him as that guy from TV and subtly enjoyed saying no. But a few, very few, had lived long enough to recognize the pattern. Every industry that laughs at the wrong person ends up paying for it later. One of those few was an older woman named Leela Hart, a retired media executive who had walked away before the industry ate her soul. She met Aaron in a cheap diner, listened to his plan over burnt coffee, and asked one question. Are you building this to prove them wrong, or because it needs to exist? Aaron paused. The honest answer slipped out. Both. Leela nodded slowly. Good, she replied. Revenge burns out. Purpose doesn't. She wired the first seed investment 2 days later, not enough to make him comfortable, but enough to make Emberline real. The race had quietly begun. The first year of Emberline was brutal. Servers crashed, bugs appeared faster than they could be patched. A marketing campaign flopped so badly that a sarcastic tweet from a random user saying, "What's Emberline?" briefly had more engagement than the app itself. Aaron slept on a futon in the office, showered at a gym down the street, and lived off instant noodles and vending machine snacks. Friends from his old life, the few who still spoke to him, suggested he give up and be realistic. But every time he considered it, he remembered the studio lights, the forced laughter, the way the host had weaponized the crowd against him. Quitting would mean they were right about him. That was unacceptable. Then something unexpected happened. A science teacher from a forgotten town uploaded a series of late-night videos explaining complex topics with nothing but a whiteboard and a tired smile. Emberline's discovery engine flagged his unusually high completion rates. People were watching entire 20-minute videos without clicking away. The algorithm gently pushed his content to more viewers. Within weeks, the teacher's channel exploded, not into mainstream fame, but into something more meaningful, a sustainable audience that changed his life. Other stories followed. A single mother teaching cooking on a broken stove, a disabled dancer choreographing routines from a wheelchair, a mechanic breaking down car scams for everyday drivers. Word spread, quietly. Emberline was where nobodies were treated like somebodies, where attention didn't depend on corporate deals or polished studios. Creators who had been ignored by major networks began to migrate, not in droves, but in steady streams. Investors who had once smirked called back with new interest. Aaron answered politely, memory like steel, never forgetting who had laughed, never letting spite cloud his judgment. The numbers grew. The service stabilized. And somewhere in a glass tower across town, executives at Meridian Broadcasting began to notice a very specific dip in their charts. Young viewers weren't just changing habits, they were leaving. And many of them were going to one place. By year 6,
Emberline had become impossible to ignore. It wasn't the biggest platform in the world, but it was the one everyone talked about in boardrooms and panic-filled memos. Networks tried to copy its format, launching half-hearted, authentic creator divisions that still felt manufactured. Others dismissed it as a fad for niche audiences. Yet the data told a different story. Advertisers started shifting budgets to Emberline, tempted by loyal micro-communities and transparent metrics that didn't hide behind vanity numbers. Each new deal chipped away at Meridian's once untouchable dominance. Inside Meridian, the mood changed from smug to strained. Ratings were down. Their attempts to go edgy backfired into public relations disasters. Damien, once the king of primetime, watched his live viewership decline as clips of genuine, unscripted moments from Emberline creators outperformed his carefully orchestrated rants. In private meetings, junior analysts nervously presented charts showing that the network's biggest threat wasn't another network. It was a platform its executives had once dismissed as irrelevant. A name kept appearing on those slides: Emberline Media. And beside it, in smaller font, the founder's name, Aaron Cole. When the board finally realized that acquisition was cheaper than slow death, they moved quickly. Offers were made. Negotiations whispered. Lawyers drafted documents describing Emberline as a strategic asset essential for long-term competitive viability. The irony was thick. The same world that had paraded Aaron's firing as proof of his incompetence now relied on him to save their balance sheets. As he sat across from Meridian's executives in a sleek conference room, pen in hand, he understood the full circle he'd been forced to run. The number on the contract wasn't just life-changing. It was history-changing. But what mattered more than the money was the clause only he insisted on.
The merger went through on a rainy Tuesday, the kind of gray day people forget, unless something unforgettable happens. Legal teams shook hands. Press releases were drafted, filled with words like synergy and innovation. Publicly, Meridian framed it as a bold move toward the future. Privately, it was an admission of failure. They hadn't adapted. They hadn't listened. So they had bought the man they once discarded. On page 17 of the acquisition contract, buried among legal jargon, sat a line few noticed. Effective upon closing, Aaron Cole will assume majority ownership of the combined digital properties under Emberline Media Group. In simple terms, the one they fired now owned the beating digital heart of their empire. Not just a channel, not just a show, the infrastructure, the data, the future. From that day on, every ad sold using Emberline's tech, every creator discovered through its engine, every viewer funneled through its recommendations, flowed through a system he had built from the ashes of his humiliation. Damien received the news in a terse email summarizing organizational changes. Claire was reassigned, then quietly phased out, her once feared name slowly erased from call sheets. They were not publicly punished. They were not dragged the way they had dragged him. Their consequence was quieter. Irrelevance. Aaron declined multiple interview requests, asking him to tell the inspiring story of his comeback. He knew the same outlets that had monetized his downfall now wanted to monetize his triumph. Instead, he gave one simple internal directive as the new power behind the scenes: no more cruelty as content. Segments that relied on public humiliation for laughs were gradually retired. Shows built on tearing down losers were replaced with formats that actually helped people. It didn't happen overnight, and not everyone was happy about it. But slowly, the culture shifted. The machine that once fed on shame began, reluctantly, to find profit in dignity.
10 years to the month after his live firing, Meridian announced a grand anniversary special.
They invited former hosts, retired anchors, and legacy talents to celebrate the network's storied history. As a symbolic gesture, they also invited their new primary digital partner, Emberline Media, to attend. Most of the old guard thought the Emberline guy would send a representative. When the black car pulled up to the studio that evening and the door opened, conversations stuttered. Phones quietly lifted. There he was, not as a guest for ratings, as the owner. Aaron stepped out in a simple, tailored suit. No entourage, no dramatic entrance, just a measured calm that came from knowing he didn't need to impress anyone anymore. The lobby that had once echoed with his rushed footsteps now held framed photos from decades of television glory. As he walked past them, he paused at a familiar spot, the stage where he had been humiliated. A new set stood there now, sleek and modern, but the bones were the same. For a brief moment, the old scene flickered in his mind. The laughter, the shaking hands, the feeling of being so small. It felt distant now, like a movie he'd watched, rather than a life he'd lived. Backstage, he crossed paths with Damien. The once untouchable host looked older, his trademark smirk frayed at the edges. For a heartbeat, tension thickened the air. No cameras, no audience, just two men, and the weight of what had happened between them. Damien cleared his throat, muttered something about, "Good to see you doing well." It wasn't an apology. It was an acknowledgement. Aaron simply nodded. "We're changing the format. Less tearing people down, more actually listening." Damien held his gaze, then looked away first. That was enough. Sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't a shouted speech. It's the quiet reversal of who needs whose approval.
When the anniversary broadcast went live, millions tuned in. They expected nostalgia, montages, maybe a few forced emotional moments. What they didn't expect was what happened in the final segment. The closing monologue, delivered by the new host, told a story, not of ratings or awards, but of a nameless young employee once humiliated on this very network who went on to build a platform that changed everything. No names were mentioned, no clips were played. But in living rooms across the country, some viewers felt a familiar sting of recognition. Others simply listened, uneasy, as the host spoke about how entertainment had too often turned real people into punchlines. Cutaway shots showed executives shifting in their seats. In the control room, producers sat unusually quiet. Somewhere in the building, Aaron watched from a small monitor, arms crossed, expression unreadable. This wasn't about reliving his pain. It was about naming the culture that had caused it, so it couldn't hide behind jokes anymore. As the monologue ended, the host looked directly into the camera and said, "Maybe it's time we stop rewarding cruelty. Maybe it's time we stop laughing at the person who hasn't finished becoming themselves." The studio stayed silent for a heartbeat. Then, slowly, the audience began to clap. Not the wild roar of entertainment, but the steady rhythm of something like respect. Outside, after the lights dimmed and the credits rolled, Aaron stepped into the cool night air. The city hummed as it always had, indifferent to individual victories and defeats. He leaned against the railing, feeling the wind brush his face, and realized something crucial. Owning the network didn't heal the wound. Time, work, and choosing who he became after the wound, that's what did it. He hadn't come back to gloat. He had come back to close the loop. To prove, mostly to himself, that the worst moment of his life didn't get to be the final chapter. Before you click away, take one breath and think about the last time someone laughed at your dream, your failure, your unfinished self. Maybe they turned you into a joke. Maybe they wrote you off entirely. Remember this. They only saw your moment, not your story. Your comeback doesn't need cameras or applause. It needs time, stubbornness, and a quiet promise to yourself that you are not done. If this story reached you, tap like, subscribe, and comment, "I'm not finished yet," so others know they're not alone. Because sometimes the people the world laughs at today end up owning the room tomorrow.